Today we are going to be talking to you about demystifying climate data tools and climate science. I come from a public health background, so this is a topic that I'm really passionate about, and I'm excited to be here today with Ryan to go through a few stories, a few ideas, and hopefully some good conversation with you all through the Poll EV tool. I'll pass it over to Ryan for our outline.
Right on. So yeah, thanks so much for having us here. We're excited to be here. Part of the whole idea of demystifying climate science and climate communication is taking us on an interesting journey. We're going to spend the first few minutes sort of doing a bit of a fireside chat, Rachel and I, where we'll talk a little bit about how climate change entered our stories, and you'll see quite different sort of entry points through our lives. And we thought maybe that would be an interesting way to sort of provide a bit of a hook for perhaps where you're at in your climate change story. We're going to then get into a conversation about barriers, challenges, and myths with regard to using climate change data and information in a practical sense, like in public health planning. We're then going to get into some of the more interactive components where we'll look at some of the latest data and tools available on some of our platforms that we either lead or co-lead with some of the country's leading climate service experts. And finally, a bit of discussion at the end about what comes next. So, like I said, we are here from, how Rachel said, we're here from the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. That's a division of Environment and Climate Change Canada. And in a nutshell, just to quickly introduce our center, our goals are to increase awareness and access to climate data. So that means making it easy to access future climate projections, historical climate trends, and everything in between. Providing training and guidance on how to use those data, engaging with users to understand what they need. So not everything the climate scientist thinks up is necessarily useful out of the box. There's a bit of a translation required there, and that's part of our role. And then developing new products collaboratively. So there's always lots of new stuff going on. So at the end, you'll have an opportunity to make sure you're signed up to stay up to speed on everything that's coming out. In short, what we do is we make climate science actionable. That's our sort of main goal. So with that bit of introduction out of the way, it's time to turn to our little fireside chat, Rachel. So yeah, like I said, we came to climate change and climate communication in very different ways. And I'm curious about your story. I thought I'd pass it to you first here.
Yeah, I'm excited to start with this little bit of storytelling, and I hope folks have can kind of join us in this little journey, because I think, just to say up front, like it's hard to use climate data and climate tools for the first time, especially if climate isn't in your job title or it's not really something you've ever done before, and it might require you to think a bit differently about your own role. So we wanted to show you a bit of what that process looked like for us individually before we go too much farther. So for me, you got a little map of my life right here. I think it's interesting, honestly, that I work for what's known as Environment and Climate Change Canada now, because when I was a kid, I was definitely an indoor kid. I had lots of allergies, and I didn't really think of nature as sort of my realm. Through my youth, I leaned a lot more towards all arts and culture, much more inclined to storytelling than sciences, which maybe is bleeding through here a bit. And as I started university, I definitely thought I'd major in English or drama or something on those lines. But around then, in this kind of like teen youth to adult years, I ended up getting a little more involved in my own community and doing like community organizing, social justice campaigns. And I ended up switching my major to political studies. I thought that was sort of going to just be a better fit for me in this calling I was starting to experience to like make a difference. And I really didn't know how to do that. So I ended up joining this youth leadership program that trained young people to take action on social issues, but also environmental issues. It was kind of a 2-for-1. And I was also getting into health and comms related work around that time. And it was the first time in my life I started to think about the environment as more than just nature or somewhere that people go camping, and more as a determinant of health, part of these like upstream forces that shape our well-being as communities and individuals.
Rachel, can I interrupt there? So can you go into that a bit more? What do you mean by upstream?
Yeah, no, this is a good term to talk through. For me, it's basically about thinking of the big picture reasons of why people end up in the healthcare system in need of care. So like if a hospital visit is downstream, then what do we see when we look upstream? What's causing health problems in the first place? And as most folks coming from a public health lens, perhaps lots of people on this call know, it's not just our genetics or, if you go to the gym that keeps you healthy. It's about access to things like education, housing, good food, and a healthy environment, an environment that sustains our lives. These are really the foundations of health. And so for me, this was a time in my life when I realized that climate was part of that picture, and that it was really the backdrop of every story, every health or political issue that I cared about. And even if I didn't really identify as an environmentalist or a climate scientist, I really couldn't separate myself from climate change and its impacts. So I did end up getting my master's in population and community health here in Saskatchewan. But I chose to write my thesis on kind of something different. I wrote about a narrative approach to thinking about public health and climate change.
What does that mean, narrative approach?
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I was concerned with the fact that even though I saw climate change as having like a major impact on health and population health in my lifetime, I really wasn't hearing about it a lot in my program. This is almost 10 years ago now, but it really wasn't on the radar, I would say. And so I opted to do a qualitative study interviewing other young people from that program and asking them about where climate change fit into their story, into their life, into their work, into their activism. And I really just wanted to know, like, how come even those of us who believe in the science and who care about other people, how come we still struggle to make climate change part of our story? And it gave me a chance to learn more about climate communications and climate psychology. And it ultimately led me to do cool communications projects like this podcast that I did for ClimateData.ca, where I first met you, Ryan, and got to interview you about climate data. And that ultimately led to my job on the outreach team at the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. So this was like a key turning point for me, thinking upstream, putting climate change kind of into that picture, and realizing that I was part of this generation that, like before us, really didn't have to worry about climate change. And I suspect that everyone kind of after my generation very much will have to worry about it and know about it and know how to engage with it in their work. So it's an interesting kind of gap to be bridging. Okay, enough about me. I would really like to hear how you found yourself to this webinar, to this work, and start all the way at the beginning.
All right, all right. No, it's always interesting to sort of compare and contrast our stories, hey? And so for me, I mean, I spent a lot of time outside as a kid, exploring the woods, going to summer camp, and eventually getting a job where I was out canoeing for 4 months of the year. But I certainly was never thinking about the environment or climate change at that point in my life. I was just out there having fun. But it no doubt instilled quite an environmental ethic in me very early on. In school, I always leaned more towards science and math, so I thought I'd sort of end up doing something maybe like in chemistry. But when I got to university, I took some physical geography courses, so that's mainly like the earth science and atmospheric science. And I thought, okay, well, this geography stuff is kind of interesting. Maybe I'll do it as a minor. And in my fourth year, I had this really unusual experience, and you can maybe imagine what this would be like. You show up to a class, and the class starts, and you realize you're the only one there, and you realize, oh, I must have the wrong date and time. But as it turned out, no, I was the only student in the class, and what that ended up turning into was this incredible friendship with this prof at the University of Winnipeg. And I turned that idea of doing a minor in geography into doing an honors major in geography. And I spent an extra year doing an undergraduate thesis. Um, and yeah, so that was really quite an interesting point in my life back in university.
So I'm curious about that, like one-on-one approach that made such a
Yeah.
difference.
Yeah. So right then, it was the first time where I was exposed to, instead of just like taking courses to pass a test, it was all of a sudden about doing research, about doing something that was new and novel. And that was incredibly exciting. And really, it was the first time I thought, hey, maybe I could do this for a living.
Yeah.
Anyways, yeah, another thing about me, I'm always was always interested in things like photography and design growing up. Um, and so geography is this really interesting blend between science and art. Like you think cartography, designing maps. And it was something I really got into. And I realized I had an opportunity because none of the other scientists at the time were thinking about design, making their stuff look nice, looking presentable, looking digestible by the public. And so for me, it was this really interesting opportunity to sort of step into that and really start to shine. Um, I did a master's thesis, as you heard, at the University of Manitoba, and after that, I went back to the University of Winnipeg, did a lot of teaching, some research contracts, and it was around this time that I came across this incredible data set. It was this Canada-wide downscale climate projections produced out of the University of Victoria, and it was about 40 terabytes in size. So it was quite the cumbersome data to access. And it was really this incredible data that I've never seen before. And so that was kind of an interesting sort of turning point, I guess, in my story as well.
A bit though, how come it was so hard to get? Or like it sounds like a lot of data, but like I don't know what it means to work with something that big.
Yeah, yeah. Well, at that time, I mean, like 40 terabytes was pretty crazy, and we didn't have a budget for expensive computers and hard drives. So I was going to Staples and buying a whole bunch of little external hard drives, and then spending literally a month downloading this data. We had a fancy fiber optic connection with the University of Victoria, so it was the kind of thing that was completely almost impossible for any person to do normally as part of a job or even just from home. It would have taken probably 4 times longer. And then also, once you've had all these data, you have to create all these custom programs to actually read it and understand it. So it was certainly not user friendly. I think around this time, a real sort of holy smokes moment came for me. I was visualizing changes in the number of 30-degree Celsius days across the country and produced a map very similar to this one. This is still one of my favorite maps of all time. This is a map that ended up in Canadian Geographic, by the way. And it shows this incredible band of red across the prairies in southern Canada, which shows a quadrupling or so of the number of these extremely hot days in a given year. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, why haven't I ever heard this before? I mean, here, like climate models have been saying this for years, but I've never seen a visual quite like this.
So at that point, were you thinking you're going to switch to climate communications over climate science?
I mean, it was starting to become that way, yeah. Around this time, I was making, maps like this, and it got the attention of a few folks, and we started working with some videographers, some writers, basically storytellers who realized the power of these maps, and we started to wrap it around into various products, and that's how the Climate Atlas eventually came to be. And ever since then, I've been working in this field of climate services, this idea of making climate data actionable and accessible and visualized. And it's been, yeah, quite an interesting experience.
Hmm. Well, thanks for sharing your story too. I think it's a great way to set up some of the tools and data we're going to show folks that now exist. And I'm thinking of you taking a month to download the data you needed for a single map. And what I'd like to do first is just ask folks on the call to go back to pollev.com /CCCS. And if you can, think about your own story and drop a pin along this kind of lifetime timeline for a moment or a turning point that for you felt like kind of maybe an aha moment or a shift in thinking about climate change. And oh, that's so great that folks are already accessing this and starting to put their dots on. If you want to use the chat and give us some information about that turning point, it looks like we're spanning the whole time frame. I'm sure there's lots of folks who are well within their career when they heard about climate change. You might be like me or like Ryan, maybe around like early adulthood, university years, starting to connect the dots. And then you lucky folks who like really felt called to this early on. I think that's really amazing. And maybe you are an indoor kid who just had something click for you, or maybe you were like Ryan and really enjoyed the outdoors. But it's great to see that connection and that relationship taking root so early. Just leave it for another minute here while we see this just populate. It's really cool. Like I said, we wanted to pause on this just because it really is important that we take this time to make an emotional and kind of personal connection to the topic for the rest of the themes to kind of hit home. So I think we'll just keep plowing ahead, Ryan. I wanted to talk about the challenges and barriers that we faced in applying climate in action, climate data, climate thinking. I think we come at this a little bit differently, but I think it's worth mentioning some of the ways in which this isn't easy to do. Otherwise, I think we maybe would have already done it. And so from the public health side, you can go to the next slide. I've got some goals that on this left-hand side here that I think for me are sort of goals of having public health folks feel comfortable engaging with climate change and climate data. I think for one, because they're great at framing the human impacts of such a big abstract problem. And we really want public health folks to be informed enough to plan ahead for the kinds of changes that we can anticipate. And I think that requires building confidence in this whole sector to engage with climate science and to know how to talk about it. But I know for me, I really get stuck in that. And especially before joining the CCCS and Environment Canada, I really had a lack of confidence in speaking to any detail in any detailed way about climate change, honestly. I knew that global warming was real. I knew it was kind of a big deal, but often wouldn't know how to get into the weeds with someone, especially if they were challenging me on that. And I really didn't have the training to even engage with the information that was available because I got pretty overwhelmed by all the technical jargon, which made it hard to communicate to others to help them find their role. Because I know that we're not each, supposed to solve climate change on our own, but it requires connecting with other people. And that was a challenge too, without having some of this background. And if you click the slide once, you'll see I was thinking of an example of this in my work before joining Environment Canada. I was working with a climate justice group in Saskatoon that went down to coal producing communities to talk about the future, of climate change, the future of their community. And I was definitely coming in with this health lens. How can we bolster community and health supports as we think about transitioning our energy and our economy? And folks in those focus groups had lots of opinions about climate change, and they asked me questions, sometimes in a hostile way. And frankly, I couldn't really engage with them that clearly or that confidently on it. And luckily, I had some great climate science friends with me to handle that. But I wish I'd had a little more confidence in being able to point to some of the basic information. And so that's often that made me feel stuck in my career. What do you think? What does this mean from like kind of a climate data perspective on putting this into action?
Yeah, so similarly, Rachel, there's a number of goals that we have, right? So, we always say that we want to produce products and services that are useful for other sectors. The problem is we still remain, despite our best efforts, quite siloed in our work. At the end of the day, I'm a climate scientist by training, not a public health expert. And that means there's a pretty big bridge that we often need to produce between different departments and different sectors. Certainly, there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the future. I mean, that's the whole big problem with climate change. It's a human-caused issue, and the future amounts of climate change are dependent on human actions. So typically, climate scientists are not really willing or able to ascribe a probability to how things will form in the future. You can't forecast climate change. You have to project climate change, which means a
Mhm.
whole range of scenarios, and we'll talk about that in a second. So that's a big barrier. I think another one, though, probably the big one here to focus on is communicating and working with data in an actionable way. I mean, that's the whole reason for our center existing. Our whole mission statement is to make climate data actionable, and that's extremely difficult. And it sort of brings in the other barriers into that one. Connecting data with action. Is the data useful? Does it solve a problem? And as we see over and over, data at the end of the day is just data. It doesn't tell a story. It doesn't tell us what the impacts are. It's just numbers.
Yeah, that is a challenge for sure. And I think actually we have an example to show of an effort to bridge this gap to put climate data into a more actionable format. This is from a few years ago. There was a package of communications materials put out about rising temperatures and how that could be driving the spread of ticks and tick-borne diseases. And I know one of your maps that you made from the Prairie Climate Center was included in this. What can we learn from this project? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting case study, I think. So this is a paper here, and I'll show a bit of a closer up version of this map in a second, but there was this research paper which looked at a few different climate change products with relation to, the spread of tick-borne diseases like Lyme disease. And so this was a map I made. It was a map that to me felt like a great product. It showed on the left-hand side, on the leftmost map, the historical temperature ranges conducive to tick development. So a certain accumulation of degree days along with a purple hatching area, which is the historic tick ranges, which tells you, hey, those things are correlated. Then it moves into the future on the center and rightmost maps and shows how those degree day accumulations are accelerating and growing, and leaving you with the opinion that we need to be concerned about the future range of tick and tick-borne diseases. Now, what this paper did is it got together a bunch of focus groups across southern Manitoba, and it showed these maps. And here's just a little bit of about what real people thought. Overall, people had a pretty negative reaction to the map. Some people got the key message that tick issues might increase in the future, but quite a few others did not put those two things together and were left confused. One person I thought was kind of interesting noted that when you make the province of Manitoba look like it's wearing a Calgary Flames jersey, it looks scary. And I think that's an interesting emotional response to something that to me was supposed to be just data, no emotions attached. And a lot of folks, like I'm sure folks here on the call are like, wait a minute, you did what? Degree day accumulations, future projections, different time periods. I mean, it's a lot of technical jargon. And when you look at the titles and the caption here, it is a lot to take in and a lot to understand. So the study also looked at a number of different products. Here was a video that was produced. And this video got rave reviews. And in part because, I mean, it was engaging. It showed people. It used trusted messengers, so it followed medical doctors, people who had contracted Lyme disease, researchers in the field, and it was an interesting sort of dichotomy, where it shows how if you wrap a problem like this in a storytelling lens, it can be much more effective in some cases to not just go and show a graph showing temperature increases or a map showing temperature increases. So yeah, I thought this was a really interesting case study, Rachel. I think you have a
Yeah,
few
no,
key
I
messages
agree.
here.
Yeah, well, we're going to be switching gears now to talk after our next poll EB question to talk about climate data tools and products and maps. And these are important. This information is really vital, but it's not the only thing that's missing for folks as they're coming to be able to use this stuff. And so, if you're using this information to prepare communities, communicate about climate change, you can click through these messages here, Ryan. I think we just want to emphasize that our role here is to point you to what data are available and guide your use of that information. But we recognize that there are limits to this. We want to do that upstream, expensive work of, gathering that big information and translating it into tools to work with. But we recognize that the trusted messengers are much more the folks on the call, the people who are in the position to wrap this in a story, make it real to people. That's not so much our work. We're really here to connect with people to make that part happen. And so that's the point of today. That's the point of the rest of the presentation, is to give you some ideas of tools that you can use to help tell these stories. And we know that there are barriers and challenges to doing that. And we just want to pause here in the middle of the presentation to just air some of those. You can use Poll EB to write in some of the challenges that you have trying to incorporate climate change into your work, and upvote some of those challenges that resonate with you. And so we'll switch over to Poll EB just for a minute here before finishing up the presentation with a walkthrough of ClimateData.ca. We're still just seeing the presentation, Ryan, if you want to. I'm not sure if we've got any.
Thank you. Yeah, just moving over now.
Perfect.
Seeing lots of great responses. And remember, you can hit that thumbs up button to help elevate any of these ideas, bring it to the top of the list.
Yeah, some stuff about silos here I'm seeing. Hard to know what data is out there.
Be a good time to note, by the way, that we'll package all these responses up and we can share them back if you're interested to read through these. Because I imagine with 100 plus folks entering data at the same time, it might go a little quick.
Awesome. Appreciate everyone offering their responses. I think in the interest of time, Ryan, let's go back to our presentation slides. It'll be
Yeah.
really interesting to go through these answers later. We really appreciate getting some feedback at this stage. I'll pass it back over to you for the next section here on our walkthrough.
Okay. Yeah, I'm excited for this part. And by the way, if you want to get ready to follow along, I recommend going to ClimateData.ca. Yeah, we'll get there in a second. All right, so just some background material here, but we like to work in collaboration with folks from all over the country. So we have a number of regional service providers, we call them, folks who have been doing this work for a long time, a lot longer than the federal government has, quite frankly. The Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium and Uranus are two organizations that have been around for a very long time. And together, we combine our efforts to produce ClimateData.ca. So if you haven't heard of ClimateData.ca, it is what we tout as kind of Canada's centralized and authoritative source of future and historical climate information. So you can explore via maps and other ways Canada-wide historical and future climate data. There's a lot of customization options, so you can perform custom analyses and download data in ways that would have taken months to build your own code or download the data. There's a learning zone. We'll touch on that later, but a great resource where we've put a lot of effort into producing interactive articles, podcasts, videos, and other sort of things that allow you to learn how to use these data out in the wild. And then a whole pile of case studies where we try to show, again, just examples of how this information can be applied across various sectors, including the health sector. So there's lots to get through. So here we are, ClimateData.ca. Here, I'll make that full screen. There we go. So like I said, you can follow along if you like. What I'm going to do here is jump into a special tool called the Spatial Analogues tool. So I'm going to go at the top here and click Apps. And the first app is Spatial Analogues. So what are Spatial Analogues? Well, in a nutshell, it's a tool that where you enter where a city you're interested in. So we're going to choose Vancouver as our example here. So take Vancouver, enter that in, and then it's going to show you a bunch of locations that exist today that have a climate similar to Vancouver's future climate. So hopefully that makes sense. So let's launch into it. And I think you can imagine how beneficial that might be to be able to see these places. So here we go. We've got a whole about the spatial analogs, how to use this app. So if you're confused, you can read through that. And I'm going to go ahead and enter in Vancouver. And I'm faced with a choice here to choose between moderate and high emissions. I'm going to go ahead and hit the high emissions button.
Let me stop you, Ryan. I want to know, okay, so
Yeah.
this is one of these moments where a public health person I think might get a little bit confused or intimidated. Like I've heard of these different emission scenarios. I get that like the amount of, emissions we creates these different potential futures. Can you just show us a little bit more about what these scenarios are all about?
Okay, yeah, good point. That's a good point. So let's just jump quickly back to the PowerPoint here. So if we think about the future, like I said kind of earlier, climate change is a human-caused problem, and so the amount of future
Four
climate
scenarios
changes.
on this slide.
Yeah, there's 4 on this slide. Yeah, so we've got the red line at the top, SSP 5 8.5. That's the high emission scenario. So that's like if we aggressively continue to burn fossil fuels into the future. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we've got the blue line, SSP 126. This is a more, I guess, utopic scenario, one where global population peters out and we increase literacy and technology rates increase and we lower greenhouse gas emissions through that. And then we've got sort of everything else in between. So if I hop back now just to the app.
So you just chose one of
SSP
those. Yeah.
Yeah. So I chose SSP 5 8.5, the high emission scenario. For me, I mean, you take your own approach on this, but I prefer to sort of plan for the worst, hope for the best. So the high end emission scenario is going to show us the most amount of change, which is maybe in some cases a bit too extreme, depending on our time horizon. But I still prefer it because it has the sort of clearest signal within it. But you can also play around with the moderate emission scenario here. So I'll choose a future time period. I'll just leave it at 2041 to 2070. That's kind of a near-term future. And then I can enter some climate indices in here as well. So let's see, I'm going to choose days with maximum temperature above 30. And I'll choose hottest day. So in other words, I'm looking at sort of the sort of hot extreme temperatures you might experience in the summertime, because I suppose in this case, I'm curious about health outcomes when it comes to extreme heat. Okay, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here. There we go. So here we go. We got a map and it shows all these dots. So we've got a purple star over Vancouver and then all these dots across North America that are purported to be decent analogs. So look at that. One of them is Winnipeg, Manitoba. What a coincidence. And so
Great.
Winnipeg, Manitoba's summer temperatures are apparently a good analog for Vancouver's future summer temperatures. To sort of prove this in a kind of interesting way, we get these little line graphs at the bottom of the app. There we go. Here, I'm just going to clean up this so it's a little easier to read. So if we look at this purple hatched area, this is the historic distribution of hottest temperature in Vancouver. So some years a little cold, some years a little hot, but in general, the hottest temperature of the year should fall within this bubble, you know, almost all of the time historically. If we turn on the green area, that's the same thing, but for Winnipeg. And you can see Winnipeg's distribution is shifted to the right. In other words, it's a hotter place when it comes to summer temperatures. And if we turn on the solid purple area, you can see how it aligns very, very well with the green area. In other words, these places are a good analog for each other. That purple star and that green circle are aligned with each other. And then you can see how through the time series, this is historical data, and then climate change kicks in and the temperatures go up. And then we've got this sort of green area. This is Winnipeg's historical values, and then superimposed over this 2041 to 2070 time period in Vancouver. So I think that's super interesting. Let's see, I'm going to hop back in just over to the PowerPoint here. Make that full screen.
Yeah, I agree that I think this is the spatial analogs tool. This is really just one tiny portion of the website, one tiny portion of the types of variables that we can explore and one way that we can do it. But I think it's a good example of making that link for both planning or for communicating about climate change. And if you go to the next slide, I wanted to show folks that, you know, taking extreme heat as our example, we don't only have to look to the future to tell this story about climate change and its impact on health. And this map shows some of the impact that climate change had on extreme heat just last year. It shows the observed heat events in 2024 that had the largest departure from normal, so hotter than hot usually gets. And there's a whole blog on ClimateData.ca about this and about the attribution study behind it. And on the next slide, I wanted to remind folks, you know, of this experience we had in BC in 2021. I was living in Victoria during this time. And I find it, you know, so shocking and interesting that in a world with just 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial, this could occur once every 5 to 10 years. So I think that's just one of those middle lines on your graph, Ryan. And so, yeah, this is already a present problem. You know, we've already seen a significant amount of change. And I think public health folks are really on the front lines to be able to frame that story and use climate data to raise awareness, to make plans, and to communicate about that. And one team that did this actually in recent years using ClimateData.ca is a team in Canmore. And they use ClimateData.ca to look at the summer temperatures in Canmore and look at how the maximum temperatures are projected to rise in a future with a high degree of climate change. And they followed up with this kind of information with calls to have more publicly available cooling centers, to scale up emergency response measures. And so it's a nice example and looking at extreme heat of where public health and environmental public health over them. We wanted to ask this question, what if Vancouver's summer temperatures were more like Winnipeg's? What if the summer temperatures in your community were to get quite a bit warmer? What would be some of the public health responses that would be needed or appropriate? Ryan, if you click through the next slide, I think we've got just a couple of examples here, but we'd really love to hear from others. What would your action be, or what would be a way that you could use climate data perhaps to move forward an issue like that? So we'll just give you a minute or two to offer your thoughts. And this is another upvote option. So if you want to just watch some answers roll in and put a little thumbs up next to the ones that you like the best, that would be great. Give you a chance to do that. Some good chatter in the chat as well. Humidity. There's some great tools on ClimateData.ca related to humidity. Yeah, more resilience in our health system. Some practical suggestions here, like tree coverage for shade, offset that urban heat island effect.
One of the big problems we have in Winnipeg, we're losing our urban canopy due to a number of diseases, Dutch elm disease being the main one, emerald ash borer being the next one on the horizon, and it's having a huge impact on the heat of just going outside. Yeah.
I know you mentioned too, Ryan, it's, a lot of homes and residential spaces in Winnipeg have air conditioning already, because historically you've had hot summers. It's the same here in Saskatchewan. But I was shocked when I moved to BC how hard it was to find an apartment with air conditioning. We were really lucky to have air conditioning during that heat dome that, people in our own city were not as lucky. But yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge consideration, even just the energy requirements of having every single home have its own air conditioner. That's something that's built into our grid system, which is not necessarily the case for all locations.
I know we
Maybe I
just have
should.
a couple of slides. Yeah, pop over to the slide deck again, because we did want to just mention a couple of other products. We obviously didn't have time to go through the whole site today, but we wanted to mention a couple, and I'll start putting some links in the chat actually of places to find these great resources, but we wanted just
Yeah,
to share a few more. Ryan, do you want to mention a couple while I grab these links?
absolutely. Yeah. So these links are going to be super helpful. And honestly, like I could demo them live, but I think it's best to just explore them at your own pace. So in the top left here, we've got the learning zone that I mentioned before. So that's your place where you can go and learn about these concepts. You want to learn more about future emission scenarios, which we had to use to understand the spatial analogues tool. There's a fantastic article there, and there's just so much more. In the top center, we've got a Humidex data set. So this is looking at future projections of Humidex, which from the poll sounds like it would be super useful for a lot of folks. There's something called the health sector module. So that includes a number of case studies and other sort of interesting health related data sets. So it's all laid out there, nice and organized, external links to a bunch of resources. We have the Analyze tool. This is a place where you can, if you're curious about analyzing a certain type of heat wave event. So for example, maybe you know in your region that a heat wave is only significant from a health point of view if it goes on for 5 days of 33.7 degrees Celsius or whatever custom metric you want. You can enter those in, analyze and download the data with no coding required. We've put together a lot of resources like this climate indices for health professionals is a great resource that Rachel put together here. And it includes a number of other blog posts we've done in collaboration with Health Canada, talking about heat preparedness and that sort of thing. So hopefully those links are going to be helpful for you. And I strongly recommend checking them out at your own time after the presentation.
Great. I think we're basically done. I just wanted to wrap up with a couple of key messages. Go ahead and click through these, Ryan, for me. If you're wanting to use this climate data to plan and prepare for changing risk conditions, we really encourage you to do so. We know that multiple lenses are needed, that climate data isn't enough, and we really need that health equity lens on things like exposure and risk to changing hazards. And like we said, there's lots of important variables and tools on the site that can help you if you're doing a vulnerability assessment or part of any process of planning ahead for a warming world. And in the more immediate term, it might be more a role of communicating about change and just making the links to health. Because as we said, we can go as far as presenting the data, but we really look to sector leaders to tell that story. And you are much more trusted as messengers on the ground to speak to both present day changes and what could come in the future. And we hope that the Spatial Analogues tool was a good example of how that might be done. There's lots of different ways to visualize information through the site. And like Ryan said, we're always working to produce articles, videos, content, infographics that help you do that. So we want to be in conversation with you about doing projects like that. And if you go to the next slide, Ryan, it just shows a number of ways people can get involved working with us and chatting with us about this stuff. We're on social media platforms. We have a newsletter at ClimateData.ca, and you'll find a number of useful links through the QR code for that. But you can also just find us ClimateData.ca on most platforms. And I think that's it. I think we've got some time for some questions, but we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, everyone.